I feel as though my mind is suffering from a kind of psychological split, from the outer to the inner room and back again from the inner to the outer room. I go back and forth aimlessly, mumbling to myself. A happy day has come. You and I, we must all be happy. I grin and shake hands with everyone I meet as if to embrace them. But, for some reason, I feel empty. As if there is a gaping hole in the corner. Japan is now completely bankrupt. But is Japan the only one? Historians are drawn to aspects of history for different reasons. I am an optimist and a hopeful person, and I believe that because of this I am drawn to moments in history that presented great opportunities for people to come together, to recognize past mistakes, and to work together to build a better world for themselves. It's why I'm so fascinated with revolutions in history. The bittersweet part of all of this, of course, is that most, if not all of these moments fall short of the hopeful dreams of the people who worked to conceive them. Another reason I'm making this video is to illuminate to a wider audience some of the perspectives that at least in the West are rarely talked about regarding the Korean War. Tong-Yōn in his book The Korean War and the Postmemory Generation says about forgetting that oblivion is not occurring due to acts of negligence, but ironically, due to the consequence of the active will to commemorate certain parts of history. In our popular conceptions of Korea, so many things sit firmly lodged as inevitabilities, and so much of the past is obscured by prejudice informed by our present. I think alternate history, when done well, can be used to dislodge some of these perceived inevitabilities, and in so doing, reintroduce that dynamic feeling of history, and dislodge established narratives whose roots will soon have grown longer than living memory. I'm going to structure this a little differently from the way I've seen alt history usually be done, more in line with how I'd write a chapter or two for my master's thesis, or how historians often structure their books, said with as little pretense as I can. That means I have to talk about other people's takes on the subject, my methodology, and so on. It's gonna be quick, but if you want to skip, there will be timestamps in the description. Alternate History Hub took a stab at it 5 years ago, and while of course I have some issues with it, for a video made 5 years ago by a creator who has grown and changed a lot since then, it's got some interesting ideas. As well as the only accurate depiction I could find in a prominent alt history video of just how repressive and brutal the South Korean regime was under the dictatorship of Syngman Rhee, an American-appointed puppet leader. On the other end of the spectrum, you have creators like What If Alt Hist, who, while being a lesser presenter, also has a framing and thesis that is far less challenging or interesting, one that's steeped in contemporary ideology as well as holdover elements of Truman-era ideology. For sure, the aforementioned better example is also a product of contemporary ideology, which is itself a product of past ideology. This video will be no different, but the point of alternate history in my mind is to present some sort of intellectual challenge that could illuminate alternate perspectives, or provide depth to dominant existing perspectives. And framing things in a way that sounds like the White House press secretary could have said it is just as uninteresting and boring as relying on the North Korean KCNA. You don't add anything to the conversation that hasn't been said a million times before by just saying North Korea bad. North Korea is bad. While most of the absurd stuff you hear out of the Hermit Kingdom is likely complete fabrications, their weird, divine, hereditary monarchical form of governance, dressed in the aesthetics and style of Cold War socialism, kinda sucks. But North Korea today is not the North Korea of 1945. Our perceptions of North Korea today shouldn't be our perceptions of North Korea in 1945, and the pathway towards present-day North Korea was contingent on factors beyond just their adoption of a socialist style of ideology, or an alliance with socialist bloc governments. In fact, North Korea would likely not exist today were it not for the United States of America's involvement. It, just like the existence of South Korea, is a product of superpowers, meddling in the affairs of other nations, peoples, or communities. This is what puts this video apart from the larger ones that I've seen on the subject, which all take for granted a Korean War. Before we get going, here's a quick rundown of the broad strokes timeline to the lead-up of the war in our world, our timeline. 15th of August 1945, Korea is liberated from Japanese occupation. Local people's committees are established all over Korea to manage affairs, in the south and the north, and govern as there's no legitimate government at this time. The people's committees organize among themselves, resembling something like a republic of many local councils. 8th of September 1945, the US Army military government occupation is established in southern Korea. 12th of December 1945, purges of the local self-governance bodies of people's committees immediately begin in the democratic American occupation zone, and this style of government is replaced by the dictatorship of Syngman Rhee. However, in the Soviet-administered zone in the north, these committees are allowed to continue. At this point, it bears mentioning that the Russian word for council is Soviet, and that Korea potentially being organized in a republic consisting of councils or Soviets, of course, predictably elicited a violent American reaction. 15th of August 1948. After numerous mass uprisings in the south against the military occupation, Syngman Rhee is elected president in an election boycotted by the majority of political parties who opposed a separate south-only election. According to the UN Temporary Commission on Korea, the result was a quote-unquote foregone conclusion. The UN endorsed the election despite observing only 2% of polling stations. The Republic of Korea was born. Guerrilla warfare against the southern regime continued for another 2 years until 1950. 9th of September 1948, elections predictably brought Korean guerrilla war hero Kim Il-sung to power in the north after having fought the Japanese for over a decade. The election was based on the existing system of people's committees, and Kim Il-sung won the election by organizing politically. Among these efforts, his party maintained an open-door policy so as to organize en masse, leading to 57% of party membership in 1949 consisting of peasants, very different from the traditional Marxist-Leninist vanguard party situation. About 12 to 14% of the population were party members. Like in the south, the north marginalized and squashed non-leftist opposition, allowing only a token opposition to exist for appearance's sake. The Democratic People's Republic of Korea was born. Now we'll pick up the pace a little bit. 25th of December 1948, Red Army withdrew from the north. 30th of June 1949, US troops withdrew from the south. 25th of June 1950, full-scale fighting in the Korean War began. As you can tell, this timeline doesn't paint the South in all too rosy of a light, and that's with good reason. South Korea for most of the Cold War was not a great place to be unless you were an official, a landowner, a business owner, and so on. It especially was not a great place to be if you held in high regard idealistic concepts such as democracy, liberty, and equality. The reason for this is to contrast what was to what could have been, and to be plain about my opinion on what happened in Korea in the early post-war years. So you don't have to read between the lines to figure out my stance on things like military dictatorship or executing political enemies. Maybe America adopted an altogether different style of foreign policy. Maybe there wasn't such a red-baiting campaign that labeled anyone left of Douglas MacArthur a communist, forcing the Democratic Party to theatrically adopt a hard line against anything left-wing so as to not be seen as soft on the Reds come elections. Maybe 2 American military officers were never hastily tasked to look at a National Geographic map late one evening and try to find some nice border for the American occupation zone, failing to do so and choosing the 38th parallel as the arbitrary border. Maybe in this alternate timeline, the Americans stayed out of Korea altogether. One major divergence is the Soviets inventing the nuke before the Americans, by just a few weeks, putting them on greater parity with the United States. Though the nature of nukes at the time means this has limited direct effect, it does encourage some closer bilateral cooperation between the two superpowers though. Another is FDR succumbing to polio in 1947 instead of 1945. And finally, a general slight shift in US anti-communist policy, allowing the whole point of this scenario to materialize in the first place. This video isn't titled "What if FDR died 2 years later" or "What if the Soviets invented the nuke first," because this video doesn't focus too much on those aspects. Instead, this video is about what sort of example Korea could have set for the US and Soviet foreign policy throughout the Cold War. What if instead of serving as an example written in blood for why it is either us or them, Korea served as an example for why sometimes, maybe most times, it's best to let a people decide its own fate on their own terms. Whenever you see history on screen like this, I'm narrating actual historical events based on research by accredited historians. When you see alt history, I'm making qualified but counterfactual assessments. The visual aid will hopefully help prevent confusion since there's going to be a healthy mix of real and not in the early years of post-war Korea. This is a world shaped in large part by a major shift in the foreign policy for both the belligerent superpowers of the Cold War. A shift that came following an example set on the Korean peninsula in the first years after the end of World War II. Without further ado, here's something that could have happened. 2 weeks after the Red Army took Berlin, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics tested its first atomic bomb at the Semipalatinsk test site in Kazakhstan. Months later, in July, a similar test was conducted in the Alamogordo bombing range in New Mexico. Both emerging superpowers now possessed the most destructive weapon so far constructed by the hands of men. August, the same year, this monstrous technology was employed in wartime for the first, but not last time, against the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, in the closing months of the Pacific Campaign against the Empire of Japan. 6 days after the atomic bombing of Nagasaki, on the 15th of August 1945, the Japanese colonial apparatus on the Korean peninsula dissolved, alongside the crumbling Japanese empire. Processions continue in many regions. Assemblies and unique meetings planned instantaneously. They happen all the time, all of a sudden, spontaneously. The old, the young, workers, teachers, lawyers, students, and merchants speak. Everyone speaks their mind, breaking the long years of forced silence, closure, and subjugation. Pania Shevchina, member of the Soviet consulate in Seoul, August 22, 1945. In Seoul, 1,000 anti-colonial resistance fighters were released from prison, speeches were held, and the old Korean anthem set to the melody of Auld Lang Syne was sung, as well as the Internationale. As Japanese troops retreated to their barracks and colonial officials nervously awaited the occupation forces, villagers banded together to preserve peace and organize local self-governing committees throughout the country. By the end of 1945, the entire peninsula was covered with people's committees at all levels down to the village. These people's committees had sections for propaganda, peacekeeping and security, food, finances, welfare relief, consumer affairs, labor relations, tenancy rates, and more. According to an American observer, the people's committees, quote, preserved the peace and collected necessary taxes, and prevented, quote, looting, bloodshed, and rioting. The Korean Revolution was underway well before the official declaration of the Korean People's Republic. Rather than viewing them as threats, the Soviets, whose forces had already entered Korea prior to Japan's surrender, supported and fostered the People's Committees. By supporting and backing leftist or Soviet-friendly political figures on the People's Committees, the Soviets were able to exert some influence on Korean politics. Their objective, however, was never to occupy Korea or set up a military occupation, but to ensure a buffer, a neutral one if necessary, against Japan. Let's jump to Europe for a moment, and stop me if you heard this one before, where tensions were running hot in the Balkans. Despite Josip Tito's designs of an expanded Yugoslavia, combined diplomatic overtures from the USSR and the United States, coupled with significant economic aid aimed at rebuilding post-war Yugoslavia, was attractive enough to prevent Yugoslavia's involvement in the brewing Greek conflict. As a result, a possible proxy war was averted in Greece. That did not mean a lack of international involvement, however. The United Kingdom, promised a 90% say in Greece by Joseph Stalin in exchange for the same in Romania, fought alongside Greek monarchist forces against the communist rebels. Due to little to no international solidarity from communist governments, the Greek communists were slowly reduced to a marginal guerrilla movement. The final communist stronghold at the massif of Grammos was not taken until 1952, owing to the difficulty of mountain fighting without proper air support. In November 1946, the People's Committee selected 1,898 representatives to meet in Seoul the following year with the mission of creating a national legislature, a constitution, and from them a government. The People's Assembly, the national legislature, had one seat for every 5 representatives from the People's Committees, totaling out at 379 seats. From this, Korea had a provisional government to carry out a revolution. With the United States maintaining a hands-off attitude, the Soviet Union withdrew in 1947 as the government of the Korean People's Republic began to take form. In real life, they would do so 1 year later. Within a year, the People's Committees had transformed Korea. 1946 became the year of the Korean Social Revolution. In March 1946, official land redistribution began to return land to those who worked it, from the hands of landlords and colonial officials. Much of this had already been well underway on an ad hoc basis, but was now formalized and given legal backing. The land reform was a result of mass rallies and demonstrations by peasants and lobbying by the Korean Peasants' League. Nearly all land confiscated from Japanese colonial officials, collaborators, and so-called national traitors was redistributed. Around 2% of confiscated land remained state-owned. This total redistribution of land was accomplished within a span of 40 days. One former landlord later said, "The new communist government took away all of our land overnight and gave it to the tenant farmers. They called it Land Reform Number 1, saying the land should belong to the people. Overnight, we lost all our ancestral land. They did let us keep the big house and 3 rice paddies that lay between our house and the church. For the first time in my life, we had to do some work." In June 1946, the labor law formalized an 8-hour workday, a standardized wage scale, 2 weeks of paid annual vacation, the right to collective bargaining, and eliminated child labor in hazardous industries. In July 1946, women were guaranteed equal rights to political participation, economic and educational opportunities, freedom of choice in marriage and divorce, and additionally, polygamy and the commoditization of women as wives and concubines through sale was outlawed. The industries, banks, and transportation services were nationalized, bringing them under public ownership. Not an altogether dramatic affair, as many of the owners were Japanese and had promptly fled the burgeoning nation so as to avoid the consequences of appearing before a revolutionary people's court, filled with the very Koreans they had oppressed for decades. National liberation also became women's liberation. In the 1920s, the Korean anti-colonial movement was radicalized by an influx of socialist ideals. Socialist women organized the Korean Women's Socialist League in 1924 for the centering of women's issues in the struggle for liberation. Alongside the moderate nationalists, Korean women formed a united front in 1927, and by 1929, this united front was dominated in large part by the socialists. Their platform included radical proposals such as the eradication of all social and legal discrimination against women, the right to education, divorce, childcare, and healthcare. For some perspective, in the United States, women were legally allowed to vote just 9 years earlier. In 1946, when the revolution finally came, pretty much all of these goals the Korean women had fought hard for decades were realized, at least nominally, in a matter of weeks. The moment power was in the hands of the Korean people again, women and men were made complete equals, which speaks to how ready Korean men and women were for this radical change. This is not to say women and men were truly equal after the gender equality law was put into practice. While women were allowed to and expected to work like men did, men were not similarly expected to labor like women. Virtually all labor in the home was still carried out by women, and suggested ways of structuring this new and revolutionary form of living left little time for sleep, when grocery shopping, childcare, laundry, washing, cooking, and of course study had to be balanced against work outside the home. While major efforts were made to diminish the burden of housework for women, for example through childcare centers, there wouldn't be adequate coverage for a few decades still. Men would still for a long time hold higher paying jobs, which in a socialist economy did not have as much of an impact on a person's living standards as it would in a capitalist one. But it did mean men would often hold higher social status. For all the major strides made in the initial years of the revolution, there was still much work left to be done. Even so, when a woman in 1948 visited a rural village to write for the Women's League periodical, she was struck by the fact that the person to first greet her was a woman, and that she, without any awkwardness, had stretched out her hand to shake hers. For many Korean women, the revolution was a bittersweet thing, because while they were now free, and the new revolutionary government was making every effort to erase all traces of Japanese colonial legacy, some scars run far deeper than others, and are not so easily forgotten. Article 7 of the Gender Equality Law of 1946 read, "Polygamy is a feudal practice from the Middle Ages, and sales of women as wives or concubines is hereby prohibited as evil practices that violate women's rights. Licensed prostitution, private prostitution, and the female entertainer system is abolished." The Japanese Empire had operated a system of organized and brutal sexual violence against women of all its imperial holdings. It was imagined with the quote-unquote high ideal of protecting the civilian population from the excesses of its own soldiers by giving them a controlled outlet. In reality, the system only exacerbated cases of random sexual violence while also organizing a system for its perpetuation. It was known as the comfort women system, euphemistically. I'm not going to talk about the shattering effects it had on women in detail. It's the sort of stuff that causes an instinctive reach for the nearest bottle. Maria Rosa Henson's testimony of her experience as a comfort woman from her autobiography is one of the most upsetting passages of text I've read in my entire life. If you at any point think I judge the Japanese Empire too harshly, or am unfair in my critique of Japanese post-war society and its failures to reconcile this aspect of its history, then listen to this excerpt that I have heavily censored to redact the most upsetting parts, and read testimonies of the so-called comfort women. No empathetic human can view these things in any other light. 12 soldiers in quick succession, after which I was given half an hour rest. Then 12 more soldiers followed. They all lined up outside the room, waiting for their turn. I could not even stand up. The next morning, I was too weak to get up. I could not eat. I cried and cried, calling my mother. Every day from 2 in the afternoon to 10 in the evening. The soldiers lined up outside my room and the rooms of the 6 other women there. I did not even have time to wash after each assault. At the end of the day, I just closed my eyes and cried. Well before the establishment of the Japanese military brothel system, the Japanese colonial administration had facilitated the creation of a prostitution industry. Many women in colonial Korea, as well as some who have traveled to Japan in search of work due to the dire economic circumstances in Korea under Japanese occupation, took to prostitution to provide for basic necessities for themselves or their families. Struggling women were often provided large advance payments, which would later bind them to brothel proprietors in perpetuity through unsustainable debts. As the system evolved into the 1930s, it became advanced with dedicated army recruiting agents to procure women. Some women were promised other work, only to be forced into prostitution upon arrival at the supposed silk factory or whatever else tale was spun by the proprietor. Distressingly, following the war, in both our alternate and our real timeline, the United States occupation of Japan and Japanese holdings did nothing to address the existence of the comfort women system, or to rectify its legacy. In the 2-year tribunal against Japanese war criminals, the issue of comfort women was never raised, despite ample evidence of these crimes against humanity on an unprecedented scale. There were only 2 cases where members of the Japanese army were prosecuted for enforced prostitution. The first happened because the slaves were Dutch, meaning they were white. The second because it came to light during an investigation into some Japanese soldiers who had offended the American flag. I am not making this up. The liberation of Korean women was bittersweet, because although they were free, their sisters and comrades in Japan and elsewhere who had been enslaved for the purpose of prostitution were less fortunate. The so-called comfort women system was continued under the American occupation. The women who had been duped or forced into prostitution in a land far from their own did not see their debts and obligation erased. The only significant change they experienced was a change in clientele from Japanese soldiers to American soldiers. The provisional government was just that, provisional. It was never intended to be any sort of permanent affair. The formation of Korea's first post-liberation government still lay ahead. To this end, real mass elections had to be organized. A significant challenge to this was literacy. Literacy is a foundational prerequisite for democracy, and so the Korean People's Republic embarked on a 3-year-long literacy campaign. Since elections couldn't wait 3 years for literacy to catch up, other measures were taken to ensure mass participation. Voting urns were colored red and black respectively to approve or reject a listed candidate. It was pretty messy and not at all a perfect system, a product of improvisation within limitations. After decades of colonial exploitation, few things felt more natural to the people of Korea than that they should chart their own path, never again to be under any nation or people's yoke. It was for this reason that after the Soviets withdrew their troops from Korea, the regular columns in the official government and organizational periodicals dedicated to highlighting the achievements of the USSR slowly began to fade away. Many of the top officials within the People's Assembly were, of course, former guerrillas trained and armed by the Soviet Union for the anti-colonial struggle. But even among those who had ostensibly fought for a common purpose for much, if not most of their lives, what sort of path the new Korean state should take was not quite clear. A new political struggle was at this time about to unfold. In 1932, during a particularly bloody purge of the Chinese Communist Party of Manchuria, which was largely made up of Koreans and not many actual Chinese people, one man had taken it upon himself to destroy any sort of evidence that could indicate his men were sympathetic to right-wing deviations. In so doing, he implicated himself, but may have saved the lives of his comrades. That man's name was Kim Il-sung, or so the story goes. Later that same year, the People's Assembly elected, in the somewhat confusing first mass election, took a vote to elect a cabinet of ministers, to replace the provisional one, and to form Korea's first government. These ministers would be subject to impeachment by the Assembly or recalled by the committees should either lose faith in the government. The cabinet was made up of senior members of the Workers' Party of Korea, by far the largest in the assembly. Among them, Kim Il-sung was made prime minister, and Kim Tu-bong president. Kim Tu-bong is a lesser-known figure in the West, but he had been a Korean independence activist since before Kim Il-sung was born. Although he was head of state, Kim Il-sung's influence was far greater, owing to Korea's domestic focus at this time. His position in the legislature, as well as Kim's political maneuvering, ensured many of the members of the Workers' Party of Korea were ardent loyalists of his. By mid-1947, Korea had a government. The flag of the provisional government was officially decided upon as the flag of this new nation. The People's Republic of Korea was officially proclaimed on the 15th of August the same year, Liberation Day. On April 12, 1947, Franklin Delano Roosevelt collapsed while sitting for a portrait. He had died of a cerebral hemorrhage. He would not finish his 4th term. The United States predictably announced a period of mourning. Shocking most, however, so too did the Soviet Union. Red flags with black borders filled every street in Moscow, and newspapers printed Stalin's condolence letter to Eleanor Roosevelt. This was a testament not only to FDR and Stalin's friendship, but also to FDR's tireless work towards global security and a lasting peace. FDR had wanted to treat Stalin as an equal and a friend, and Stalin had wanted the same. The Soviet Union, the largest socialist power on the planet, hailed the president of the largest capitalist superpower on the planet as the great organizer of this hard-won peace, and as a hero of the workers. It's a powerful moment in history. All of this happened, except in real life FDR died under the same circumstances on the same day in 1945. A bit of a side note, but in 1949, at the Malmedy trial, the trial of the Nazi war criminals who had executed 350 unarmed American POWs, an up-and-coming senator had tried to make a name for himself by coming to the defense of the Nazis, partially due to his largely German constituency. That man's name was Joseph McCarthy. His opportunistic strategy had backfired, and his voters were neither inclined to vote for McCarthy the Nazi lover or McCarthy the commie hater, as he tried to rebrand himself. Of course, in real life, things went sort of according to Keikaku for Senator McCarthy. In 1949, the French counterinsurgency campaign against the forces of the Viet Minh, or the League for the Independence of Vietnam, erupted into full-scale conventional warfare, when the forces of the Viet Minh, who had been supplied with modern weapons by the People's Republic of China, declared the founding of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. The United States, still mostly adhering to its more peaceable strategy vis-à-vis the communist bloc, were reluctant to get involved. The Soviet Union likewise honored its agreements with the United States until a later crisis in 1950. Back to Korea. Korea, especially in the north, was already quite industrial, with modern and functional infrastructure built during the Japanese occupation. However, much work remained in order to realize a dual aim of self-sufficiency from the Soviet Union and providing for the Korean people. For many countries in the so-called Third World in this period, the Soviet example in which a country was transformed from a backward agrarian one into a modern industrial economy was attractive, and Korea was no different. By 1948, the Korean People's Assembly had drafted programs for the buildup of heavy industries, limited consumer goods, and for the most part a withdrawal from, and therefore a lack of reliance on, the capitalist world economy. This is exactly what happened in the real world, where North Korea's economic development was actually faster and far more prosperous than that of the South, owing, in my view, to its obvious industrial head start coupled with efficient economic planning for a time. In the real world, this economic prosperity would stagnate in the 1970s, and in the 1990s, North Korea saw devastating famines. We're going to get to how this unfolds in this alternate timeline later. Similar to Stalin's first 4-year economic plan of 1929 to 1933, the Korean People's Republic embarked on a project of quote-unquote primitive socialist accumulation, essentially the transfer of surplus from agriculture to the state, in order to purchase from abroad the means to industrialize. A 15% tax on agricultural production was introduced to finance the industrialization program. Floods in 1946 and 1947 hurt food supplies, and some rationing in the northern parts of Korea was instituted. But the production deficiencies of the north were made up for by the south, and vice versa. But these were still meager times. Before the Soviet withdrawal in 1947, the Koreans were also paying a 5% grain tax to the Soviet Union. The grain was largely shipped to the Soviet Far East. In our timeline, this was a 15% tax, only levied on the relatively grain-poor North Korea. The Korean planned economy was also taking shape. Each year, the Popular Assembly defined rough economic targets for production for each region of Korea. These targets were then sent to local administrative organs, and the People's Committee sent assessors to evaluate the assumed production of farms and factories, so as to assess whether they would be able to comply with the production targets. Each farm household was also asked to do their patriotic duty by providing one family member to work for 1 or 2 months at a local public works project in the area around their home, such as building roads or bridges. All able-bodied persons in the cities were also required to work a few weeks a year at a nationalized worksite, such as a factory or a mine. Despite the peasantry's grumbling and the heavy-handed methods utilized to modernize Korea's industrial output and carry out necessary land reforms, the peasantry and the city dwellers were both in large part better off after the government's reforms. This was also true in real life. On the whole, standard of living increased drastically over the first couple of years of the Korean Revolution. Despite pursuing a sort of self-reliance, Korea increasingly received Soviet aid until 1952, when the aid began to slow, until ceasing entirely in 1954. One interesting aspect of Korea's socialist-esque economic path was that under the premiership of Kim Il-sung, the traditional Marxist doctrine of material conditions leading to political and cultural transformation was reversed. Kim Il-sung decreed that the opposite was to happen. He argued that political transformation, the literacy campaign developing popular consciousness, and the egalitarian reforms would themselves enable the construction of a socialist economy. Essentially, the socialist economy would not flow naturally from the development of productive forces, but would be instituted from above. At the very onset, the industrialization was slow and behind schedule, but by 1949, things were proceeding ahead of schedule. In the real world, North Korea, which the People's Republic of Korea is modeled strongly on, though without many of its deficiencies, maintained strong control of trade unions and other labor organizations in order to maximize output, believing earnestly that increasing production was key to increasing standard of living and therefore achieving some form of socialism. In the People's Republic of Korea, however, these labor unions were allowed to agitate, organize, criticize the government, and confront it through strikes and other collective action. After all, without workers' rights, how can you call yourself a workers' state? The Taiwan Strait became the very first flashpoint for the possibility of a hot war between the now nuclear superpowers of the United States and Soviet Union. As part of the ongoing Chinese Civil War, the People's Republic of China had forced Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist government to abandon mainland China completely in 1950 and flee to Taiwan, then Formosa. ROC forces, Republic of China, still held a handful of islands between Taiwan and the mainland, which were the site of a fierce back-and-forth artillery duel. The Joint Chiefs of Staff unanimously recommended Douglas MacArthur to head the U.S. response to the Taiwan Strait crisis. At the same time, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff Arthur W. Radford petitioned for authorization to utilize nuclear bombs stationed in Okinawa should the necessity arise. In 1948, the Central Intelligence Agency was formed to take on duties similar to those conducted by the Office of Strategic Services before its dissolution in 1945. One of the Central Intelligence Agency's prime duties on its conception was the execution of covert activities aimed at subverting or preventing communist influence in foreign nations. To this end, the CIA established secret camps in Taiwan for the education and training of nationalist guerrillas and political cadres as stay-behind operatives following a possible invasion, or to be shipped to mainland China should the nationalist government manage to repel an invasion. An invasion was considered imminent in the eyes of the CIA already in 1950, when they predicted Taiwan would fall to Mao Zedong's forces within a year. This prediction is real, and is a real CIA document you can read. This marks an early dub for the CIA, who in our timeline are usually pretty bad at most of what they do. Following the United States' direct backing of nationalist Chinese forces on Taiwan, ever-paranoid Joseph Stalin, growing increasingly wary about his staunchly anti-communist American counterpart Harry S. Truman, authorized committing arms and advisors to both the People's Republic of China and the Vietnamese insurgent forces. October 1950, the ongoing long-range artillery duel between communist and nationalist forces on the islands between Taiwan and mainland China escalated when the People's Republic of China attempted invasions of these stepping stone islands using motorized junkers and what little navy it still possessed. In response, the United States escalated its shipment of munitions, artillery, and airplanes. Though the quality of individual materiel for the war in the Nationalist Air Force was inferior to the Soviet-supplied weapons platforms, the quantity of US support was much greater, as the Soviets were reticent to attempt to penetrate the ROC naval blockade of mainland China, since it could lead to a possible escalation. Stalin would lament having to deal with the unpredictable and hawkish Truman, much preferring his rapport with the late Franklin Delano Roosevelt, whom he felt he could engage with as equals. The superior nationalist naval forces were able to hold back the Chinese invasion for a time, but with mobilization and preparation, the likelihood of a full-scale invasion of Taiwan was growing with every day. In the spring of 1951, after the islands between Taiwan and mainland China had been conquered as a prelude to invasion, and temporary airfields established on these islands to allow China's new Soviet-supplied MiG-17s to truly contest nationalist air superiority over the strait, the stage was set for the invasion. At this point, the Joint Chiefs of Staff wanted to escalate somehow without putting boots on the ground, which could result in a drawn-out war with China, so they opted instead for a different form of escalation. In order to hopefully neutralize the threat of invasion, the Joint Chiefs of Staff authorized MacArthur's crackpot plan of using a nuclear bomb on Kinmen, an island that was serving as a staging point for the invasion. The island was also chosen due to having been evacuated during the artillery duels between China and Taiwan earlier. The hope was, like with Japan, the bomb would make China think twice about its plans to invade, and with minimized civilian casualties and the target being of immense strategic importance, a nuclear bomb was dropped on Kinmen on March 12, 1951. And the plan worked for a while. The political fallout from the use of the atomic bomb, a prospect that was deeply unpopular with the American people in the real-life Korean War, and similarly so in this fictional Taiwan War, had plummeted President Truman's approval and had forced the sacking of General MacArthur. Due to pressures from Congress, who very much wanted MacArthur in Truman's head, the United States began limiting their material support. In early 1952, the Taiwanese Air Force was exhausted due to a lack of American reinforcements, and its navy had suffered heavy losses from Chinese bombing. The stage was once again set for an invasion. The invasion was an immensely bloody affair. Not even counting the casualties from the island invasions preceding the main invasion, casualties on this island, still inhabited by civilians, numbered just over 1 million. 50,000 were lost in the first few weeks alone. The fighting proper lasted for 4 months, and low-intensity quote-unquote pacification skirmishes lasted for another 4 months. By the end of May, 4 months after the first communist soldiers set foot on Taiwan, the Republic of China was no more. Chiang Kai-shek had committed suicide before Mao's forces had reached him. The majority of the lives lost were from among the civilian population, who were either conscripted out of desperation or effectively used as human shields. The devastation of Taiwan's infrastructure and the disease and scarcity that followed were responsible for most of these deaths. In 1953, Stalin died of a cerebral hemorrhage, much like his counterpart Franklin Roosevelt had done just 6 years prior. This left the hawkish Churchill the only one of the 3 titans of the Second World War still alive and in office. The Soviet Union went into mourning, and before too long Nikita Khrushchev had emerged as Stalin's successor. While urbanization in Korea had begun, and while Kim Il-sung's Manchurian Communist Circle had largely gained control of many of the people's committees, Kim's propagation of his new Korean ideology of self-reliance, coupled with a much larger rural population in the south and in our real timeline, merged to create a monster out of his control. The Korean Peasants' League, throughout the 1950s, began wresting control of the Southern People's Committees, and while the pace of industrialization was rapid, it was not quick enough to provide adequate returns on the heavy grain tax levied on the peasants to finance the growing industries. This resulted in the delegates of the Korean Peasants' League demanding Kim Il-sung's impeachment, ousting Kim Il-sung from power, though he would remain a member of the assembly for many years still. The Soviet Union's preferred candidate was gone, the final vestige of overt Soviet influence over Korean politics. Taking his place was a man who had fought for Korean independence before Kim Il-sung was even born, Kim Tu-bong. Though the early groundwork for this policy had been laid under a premiership of Kim Il-sung, Kim Tu-bong was to be remembered as the one to steer Korean foreign policy onto the world stage. The first signs of the characteristic Cold War Korean foreign policy were already seen in its pursuit of a simultaneous self-reliance and also participation in the socialist world order emerging through the Soviet Union and China. The second signal was Korea covertly supplying the Viet Minh with arms in the latter years of the Indochina War. Shortly after Kim Il-sung's ousting in 1955, the People's Assembly, at the direction of Premier Kim Tu-bong and his cabinet, debated and finally formulated a defined strategy for Korea's future foreign relations and its position between the world hegemons. Korea was to position itself as an ally to and champion of decolonizing nations. Its mission was to foster national liberation movements across the globe, both as a means to grant other peoples the independence and opportunity offered to them, by their liberation from Japan, but also to gain international prestige and influence among emerging regional powers. To this end, Kim Tu-bong found no better allies than Indonesia's Ahmed Sukarno and Cuba's Fidel Castro, and the Koreans would likewise be vital allies of the Cubans and Indonesians. In fact, when Sukarno faced the possibility of a military coup in 1956, it was vital Korean military aid to Sukarno's loyalists that turned the tide. The so-called monster of the Showa era, Nobusuke Kishi, who administered Japanese Manchuria under its occupation in the 1930s, was elected Prime Minister of Japan, following his political maneuvering to gather right-wing political forces under the umbrella of the Liberal Democratic Party, ushering in Japan's so-called 1955 system, which is the de facto one-party system that persists in this day in real life. Kishi quickly pursued the ratification of a new constitution, removing Article 9, which prohibited Japan from possessing the capability to project force outside of Japan, this being done to facilitate an already agreed-upon purchase of the new-built for export French Dassault Mirage 4 strategic bombers. Nobusuke Kishi himself was administrator of Japanese Manchuria, inseparable from the comfort women system, the slave labor employed in Manchuria, and a host of other Japanese war crimes. Kishi is also the late Shinzo Abe's grandfather, by the way. Despite the strategic advantage offered by US forward bases on Japan, US President Kennedy threatened a drastic reduction of US military assistance to Japan's self-defense forces. Kennedy was in secret correspondence with Premier Khrushchev of the Soviet Union, who regrettably had to offer his Korean allies security through similar means should the Japanese be allowed to strengthen their offensive capabilities beyond the so-called self-defense measures allowed by Article 9 of Japan's post-war constitution. Prime Minister Kishi ignored the advice of Kennedy, and before too long, the Japanese self-defense forces were legally allowed access to measures of force projection. The United States remained a presence in Japan, particularly on Okinawa, until 1963. Withdrawing after tensions between Korea and Japan intensified at the same time as the United States was involved in other matters closer to home. In the preceding years, Korea had already been going on a diplomatic offensive against Japan, and therefore also the United States, through institutions like the United Nations. The Korean petition to the United Nations to investigate the military and government of Japan for its complicity in crimes against humanity through the Comfort Women system passed in the United Nations, and the UN formally requested Japan comply with the investigation. Score 1 for human rights. Prime Minister Kishi immediately refused to comply with the UN investigation. Score 1 for war crimes, I guess. What followed was a steady decline in relations between the staunchly left-wing anti-imperialist Korea and the staunchly right-wing Japan, who refused to reconcile its imperialist past. Upon Japan acquiring its strategic bombers, Korea began manufacturing and acquiring long-range missile systems, with the goal of being able to threaten Tokyo before Japanese bombers could reach Korean shores. This then prompted the Japanese to investigate the development or acquisition of similar weapon systems. By the early 1960s, a drawn-out missile crisis was unfolding between Korea and Japan, and by the mid-1960s, both nations had initiated nuclear weapons research programs. The steady escalation only ended in 1968, when the now nuclear-equipped People's Republic of China, understanding the disaster a Japanese-Korean confrontation would cause for Asia and its ambitions there, helped facilitate a bilateral denuclearization agreement between Japan and Korea. Japan and Korea would both eventually possess functional nuclear reactors, but after the withdrawal of US forces from Japan, atomic weapons would never again be stationed on either Korean or Japanese shores. American leadership of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization had increasingly been challenged by emerging integrated European defense cooperation in the decade following the atomic bombing of Kinmen. The implication that a maverick United States could plunge the world into another war similar to that of World War II, but with far more destructive weapons technologies available at this time, frightened European nations to say the least. What resulted was a slow shift during the 1950s towards a de facto joint European leadership position in NATO between the United Kingdom, France, and West Germany. The United States still maintained soldiers and bases in Europe, though the majority of NATO's bases would come to be run by soldiers of the aforementioned nations. With the shift of leadership from a nation that, despite its tendency to involve itself in imperialism a lot of the time, was still in favor of decolonization, to the leadership of suzerains of the largest colonial empires on the planet, NATO's role shifted somewhat. NATO in this timeline would come to be much more involved in the maintenance of Britain and France's colonial empires due to a more liberal interpretation of Article 5. These colonial empires persisted a little longer than in our timeline as a result of the much more bloody repression of movements for national liberation. The involvement of NATO in foreign wars of little interest to non-colonizer nations led to an increase in skepticism towards NATO towards the 1980s. That culminated in Iceland, Denmark, Sweden, and Finland signing a formal Nordic defense alliance and ending its contributions of soldiers and material to NATO's wars in Africa. It should be noted that Denmark does hold overseas colonies such as Greenland, and that parts of Norway, Sweden, and Finland's northern landmasses consist of land colonized from the indigenous Sami population, but if you were to scrutinize Europe under a strict definition of colonizer, I doubt anyone would fare too well. Maybe Switzerland. Following the Taiwan Strait War and the atomic bombing of Kinmen, smaller nations, largely in the global south, began to forge closer bonds so as to find partners who association with wouldn't immediately put them on the shit list of a nuclear-armed superpower. This loose-knit association of nations began with Yugoslavia, India, Egypt, Ghana, Indonesia, Hungary, and Korea in 1961, though would later come to include Cuba, Vietnam, and many other decolonized nations. Although principally unaligned and seeking no conflict with either the capitalist power bloc or the socialist bloc, the activities of the non-aligned movement under the influence of Korea put it at odds with the goals of both the so-called West and the so-called East. Among its chief projects were the opposition to apartheid regimes, anti-racism, decolonization, and the economic development of decolonized nations through alternatives to Western capitalist institutions like the IMF. John F. Kennedy was assassinated on November 22, 1962. His vice president, Lyndon B. Johnson, a man famed for whipping his penis out at every possible opportunity, succeeds him as president. A major thorn in the US's side for the past decade had been the Caribbean island nation of Cuba. Though there was little risk of Cuba itself becoming a major threat to the United States, with Soviet-US relations still being somewhat amicable, Cuba's foreign policy and its categoric support for any left-wing insurgency in Latin America that wanted weapons eventually became a real headache for US foreign policy in the region. This led President LBJ to authorize a harebrained scheme that had already been in development under Kennedy to send specially trained Cuban expats, with American air support painted to look Cuban, in order to force a change in the Cuban regime. And funnily enough, the scheme worked, sort of. The initial assault was somewhat disastrous, but the US-trained commandos who had made it to shore went into hiding in order to carry out long-term sabotage actions against Cuban infrastructure. A month later, an American cargo ship was captured by Cuban authorities, claiming it was dropping supplies by way of dinghies to the right-wing guerrilla forces. This led the US to petition the United Nations for a peacekeeping mission to Cuba to restore order and safeguard commercial interests in the region, lest the Cuban conflict boil over to encompass other parts of the Caribbean. The proposal was voted down, and later vetoed in the Security Council by the Soviet Union. Without the legitimacy of the United Nations backing them, LBJ and his massive schlong said, "We'll do it anyways." A bombing campaign, titled Operation Rolling Thunder, preceded the naval landings, destroying key infrastructure in an effort to soften up Cuba for invasion. The campaign lasted 5 months and would be the cause for most of the civilian casualties on Cuba. The US invasion of Cuba was swift. The initial landings were deadly, like all naval landings are, and attempts at airdropping troops had ended in disaster. Nonetheless, the US Air Force, Navy, and Army made short work of Cuba's military forces as well as its civilian infrastructure. A US occupation was initiated with the intent of rebuilding and restructuring Cuba along American principles of democracy and free enterprise. Because of this, in this world, Mexican and American coke tastes the same due to Cuba's sugar plantations. The US occupation proved to be a long and arduous one, characterized by low-intensity asymmetric warfare conducted by Cuban guerrillas aided by other Latin American leftist radicals. Many of these guerrillas fought with Korean weapons. In 1981, President Carter, entering his second term, had announced mission accomplished. The US mission in Cuba was over, and it was up to Cubans to carry the torch of liberalism. 3 weeks after US troop withdrawal, the American puppet government fell to left-wing guerrillas carrying Korean arms, and President Fidel Castro returned from his exile in Chile. This to the jubilation of many Cuban workers and the horror of many American and Cuban business owners who had established themselves in Cuba after the occupation. American coke goes back to tasting like corn syrup. Fast forward to 1971. Despite a somewhat belligerent foreign policy by both the United States and the USSR, largely against nations aligned with the other superpower, and through proxy wars such as the Taiwan Strait crisis and the US occupation of Cuba, both superpowers maintained a pragmatic friendship in the interest of security that after the end of the US occupation of Cuba would normalize further into outright cooperation on issues like science, economic and humanitarian aid, international trade, and, to an extent, even security. In real life and in this timeline, in 1961, Yuri Gagarin had become the first human to orbit the Earth, and when he did, he made the following remark. "Orbiting Earth in the spaceship, I saw how beautiful our planet is. People, let us preserve and increase this beauty, not destroy it." With the space race taking more the character of a friendly competition rather than the pursuit of military advantage, US and Soviet scientists worked together to accomplish humanity's first moon landing. After failed attempts in the late 60s and early 70s, with issues on both sides, in 1971 the US and Soviet space programs both launched their respective craft along a meticulously planned schedule that would see the craft land on the surface of the moon roughly at the same time. Technically, the Soviets had pushed the safety margins in order to land a few minutes before before the United States. But in the interest of optics, both sides suppressed this information. Miraculously, both missions succeeded, and people all across the world were treated to split-screen footage of American astronauts and Soviet cosmonauts bouncing around at their respective landing sites. Lunar rovers had been made to facilitate further exploration, but also perhaps to the rest of the world, the most important part of the mission: a handshake between a Soviet cosmonaut and an American astronaut on the surface of the moon. The first words to be uttered on the surface of the moon had been deliberated on carefully by both agencies and governments, and were spoken simultaneously by astronaut Neil Armstrong and cosmonaut Alexei Leonov as they shook hands on July 24, 1971. One small step for us, but a giant leap for all mankind. A quick self-critique note: this video was very East Asia, Euro, and North America centric. Very little thought was put towards happenings in Africa or South America. I wish I could have covered everything, particularly stuff like India and Britain, Britain and Egypt, the Angolan Civil War and more, and I apologize for the narrow scope of the video. The invasion of Cuba was intended as the last vestige of old American foreign policy manifesting itself, leading the Soviets to think twice about Afghanistan. After all, they had a great example of why live and let live might not be so bad, an example set on the Korean peninsula. Part of the reason I made this video is that upon studying it further, I have come to hate the Korean War more than most wars, specifically because it was such a preventable war. There were so many junctures where decisions could have been made which would not have led to escalating tensions. So many lives were lost and so many unforgivable crimes were committed against the Korean people in a senseless struggle after they had already been liberated from oppression. North Korea is no state to aspire to by any means today, but we have to recognize that under a US-led UN intervention, that country was leveled to the ground and its people massacred. The massacres began even before the war, at places like Jeju Island. And after the war, the country was dealt the shock of total isolation, forcing a siege mentality from which few nations, I imagine, could emerge with much in the sense of liberties or democratic institutions that we put so much value in. Remember, Kim Il-sung's purges and his rise to de facto dictatorship did not happen until after the Korean War. North Korea should have just been another country, albeit a weird one maybe, but maybe one whose people would suffer less from the West's refusal to engage with them in any meaningful manner. If we can get along with Saudi Arabia, why not North Korea? The answer, I think, lies in the late 1940s. Forgotten, never re-examined in any meaningful way, because I think if we did, we'd have a hard time looking at ourselves in the mirror. I want to give a special thank you to Fyodor for inspiring this video and some script revisions. You can find them at Female Kissinger on Twitter. You won't see her tweets though, since she deletes 90% of them 8 seconds after posting. Thank you to Cody from Alternate History Hub for giving me pointers on structure and for making the videos I watched so many of years ago. For help with sources, I want to thank H from the Discord, Remy from Remy's Studio for a veritable treasure trove of literature, and AZT99 from Twitter. I want to thank Shado for helping me get in touch with some Korean speakers. I want to thank AFK, Redacted Ishluja, or however you pronounce your name, I'm sorry I keep messing it up, Crimson Crash, and Braden from Patreon. Finally, I want to thank you for watching. I've never done anything like this before, and I hope it was good.
Ich bin ein Musikant. Ich spiele so brillant. Am besten sind Kosmosland. Und wir sind fröhlich und völlig gesättigt. Ja, wir sind fröhlich und völlig gesättigt.